The feeling that we call instinct appears to be tied to a physiological process in which stored-up energies strive for release. The instinctual drive terminates when these energies find expression in action. If it is simply an instinct, then it is satisfied as soon as it has dissolved into action. In contrast with this direct causal process, which is reflected in consciousness as a primitive instinctual feeling, are those actions that arise, so far as our consciousness is concerned, from a representation of the ends that they will achieve. In this case, we experience ourselves as being drawn rather than driven. The feeling of satisfaction, therefore, does not arise from the action alone, but from the consequences that the action produces. If, for instance, an aimless inner unrest drives us to furious activity, then this belongs to the category of instinctual behavior. If we undertake the same activity in order to attain some precise kind of well-being, then it belongs to the category of purposive behavior. Eating exclusively to satisfy hunger falls within the first category, eating to enjoy the flavor of the dishes falls within the second. Sexual intercourse as an animal instinct belongs to the first category, but as an activity directed to the attainment of a particular kind of pleasure it belongs to the second. This distinction seems to me vital in two respects. To the extent that our actions are purely instinctual, that is causally determined in the strict sense, there is a fundamental incongruity between the psychological state, which is the cause of action, and the ensuing consequences. The state that moves us to action has no more significant qualitative relation to the action and its result than has the wind to the falling of the fruit that it blows from the trees. On the other hand, when the conception of an end is experienced as a motive, cause and effect are congruous in their conceptual and perceptible content. Nevertheless, in this case too, the cause of action is, even though this cannot be defined in a strictly scientific way, the real force of the conception or of its physical correlate, and this force or energy must be rigorously distinguished from the intellectual content of the conception. The content itself, as an ideal representation of action and events, has absolutely no force. It possesses only conceptual validity and can become real only to the extent that it is endowed with real energy, in the same way as justice and morality, as ideas, have no historical influence until they are adopted as determinants of action by real powers. The controversy over the relevance of causality, or teleology, to human action may thus be decided in the following way. Since the consequences of action exist in a psychologically effective form before they acquire an objective existence, a strict causal relation can be upheld. Only those intellectual conceptions that have become psychological forces need be taken into account, and thus cause and effect are entirely distinct, whereas the identity between the intellectual content of motive and consequences has absolutely nothing to do with the actual production of events. Another difference between instinctual drives and purposive striving is still more significant for the present problem. To the extent that our action is simply causally determined, in the strict sense, the whole process comes to an end when the turbulent forces are discharged in activity, and the feelings of tension and constraint disappear as soon as the instinct culminates in action. The instinct consumes itself by its natural continuation in action, and the whole process remains confined within the individual. The process that is guided by a conscious purpose is entirely different. It is directed to a definite objective result of action, and it attains its final end through the reaction of this result upon the subject or of the subject upon the result. The fundamental significance of purposive action is the interaction between subject and object. Our mere existence involves us in this interaction, and purposive action is therefore rooted in the nature of the mind. Our relationship to the world may be represented as an arc that passes from the subject to the object, incorporates the object and returns to the subject. It is true that every fortuitous and mechanical contact with things displays the same external character, but as purposive action it is suffused and held together by the unity of our consciousness. As natural beings, we are in constant interaction with the world of nature, and coordinated with it. It is only in purposive action that the self as personality differentiates itself from the natural elements within and outside itself. Or regarded from another aspect, it is only when a purposive agent is distinguished from the purely causal system of nature that the unity of the two can be re-established at a higher level. This theoretical relationship is to be found, with some modifications, in the difference that is supposed to exist between the labor of civilized and primitive peoples. The former is said to be regular and methodical, the latter irregular and spasmodic. In other words, the former involves deliberate overcoming of our resistance to work, while the latter is only a release of nervous energy. This does not mean that the real purpose of all purposive action is located in the acting subject, that the reason for attaining an objective always lies in the feelings that are retroactively aroused by the object. This may be the case in egoistic actions proper, but there are innumerable other actions in which the identity of motive and result is concerned only with the result in the sense of attaining the object, with the non-subjective happening. The inner energy which determines our action frequently takes into account consciously only the objective result, and excludes from the teleological process any further retroactive effects upon ourselves. Yet unless the result of our activities ultimately produced an emotion in us, the conception of it would not generate any motive force to bring it into existence. This final link in the chain of action is not, however, its final purpose. Our teleologically determined volition ends very often with the objective result and does not consciously inquire beyond this point. Purposive action in contrast to causal instinctive action, it remains to be seen whether this distinction is, so to speak, only one of approach or method, may be formulated thus: purposive action involves the conscious interweaving of our subjective energies and the objective world, and a double impact of reality upon the subject. First, in an anticipation of the content of reality in terms of subjective intention, and second, in a retroactive effect of the realization of the object in terms of a subjective emotion. The role of purpose in life evolves from these conditions. It follows from this that so-called unmediated purposes contradict the very concept of purpose. If purpose means a modification within objective being, this modification can be achieved only by an action that transmits the inner acceptance of the purpose to the realization of the modification. Our actions are the bridge that makes it possible for the content of the purpose to pass from its psychological form to a real form. Purpose is necessarily bound up with its means. It differs in this respect from a mere mechanism and its psychological correlate, instinct, in which the energies of each moment dissolve in the immediate result without pointing to a further stage. The next stage arises only from the immediately preceding one. Purpose has three elements, whereas mechanism has only two. On the other hand, purpose also differs, by virtue of its dependence upon means, from what one might call divine action. In the case of a god, it is impossible that there should exist a temporal or material interval between the will and the deed. Human action that is interposed between these two elements is only the vanquishing of obstacles that cannot exist for a god, unless we think of him in terms of terrestrial imperfection. His will must be already the reality of whatever he wills. One may speak of God's final purpose for the world only in a very qualified sense, namely as the ultimate temporal condition that concludes its destiny.